I just want to make a bit of a plea in this video for sloppy research, or at least for, yeah, I mean, no, it's not a plea, maybe it's just an observation. What I've seen over the last couple of days is several people referring to research and the necessity for research to be effective prior to videos being made. I think Tattoo Skin said something which Uj took the wrong way, or took as being a slight on his ability to research certain facts before making a video. A couple of people, Dana Garrett, one or two other people, criticised my own research. You know, like, why do people read a book before they go for a walk? That kind of comment. I've just been looking at a comment here that Sale Polani made, aimed at someone I didn't know. You know, which was something about, you know, feeling slighted or feeling offended because someone had perhaps suggested that they hadn't carried out research, and yeah, and just that whole thing really. And it's I don't know. I don't want to make a plea for bad research, but I do want to make some comments about that, because you know, research is important. You know, and I work in academia, so research is part of my bread and butter really, and I know how those processes work, and I know that if you're involved in academia, one of the last things you want to do is go off half-cocked. You know, I mean, I've certainly done conference papers or done bits of writing that haven't been finished. You know, that the research hasn't been up to snuff, and I've been absolutely called on it, and similarly, you know, I've been at conferences and seen people do presentations, and their research has been inadequate, or they just haven't understood the background context that they've been researching properly. And again, they've been called on it, and it's a bit of a blood sport, you know, the academia in that regard. So you can't let your guard down. You can't. You have to follow proper academic procedures in terms of referencing your sources, in terms of demonstrating your knowledge of the context, the academic context. All that kind of stuff has to be in place. And also, of course, you don't open your results up to public scrutiny too early. You don't reveal your processes too early. You kind of anticipate in private all the possible critiques that can be made of your work, and only then, when you're absolutely sure that you've covered all the possible criticisms, then do you release it, making sure it's rock solid. And it's fine, you know, and for its function within that specific professional setting, it's absolutely fine. But there are some drawbacks of that, and for me at least, YouTube offers an alternative to that. The drawbacks are several. Firstly, the drawback is it tends to reinforce an understanding of what constitutes knowledge as being very clearly delineated, that there's no fuzziness between what we know and what we don't know. You know, when the only thing that qualifies as, when we understand knowledge as being that which follows rigorous research protocols, demonstrable in things like peer review and in things like proper referencing and in things like proper research, then you know, it delimits it in a very interesting way, and also it kind of renders it private, because that's, as I said before, that whole process by which knowledge is generated, by which research is carried out, tends to be very secretive. You know, you don't release your process early. You don't open up your findings usually, or open up your mode of inquiry. You don't go off half-cocked, you know, you don't. You have to make sure everything's done, and it tends to be held very close to your chest until you release it to the world. So it has this very secretive and private quality to it, and I regard that as a drawback. I'm in favour of transparency, and I like transparency. You know, and that whole privacy thing, it buys into, or it contributes to a kind of professionalism, or an over-professionalisation really of certain kinds of knowledge communities, which in some cases is distasteful. So whilst I know the value of research and while I can see the importance of it, I think there are drawbacks. YouTube for me has always, the couple of years I've been on here, has represented an alternative to that. You know, I have that in my professional life to an extent. But YouTube, as I say, is an alternative, my YouTube channel, which now has got a subtitle, Badly Manufactured Profundity, which I borrowed from a comment that 2B Serious made. I think she meant it as an insult, but I took it as a description. Manufactured Profundity. But my subtitle used to be Steam from the Half Bakery, because I quite like the idea of things being half baked. Not because half baked ideas are good, but because the baking process is nice when it happens in public, or when it's collaborative, or when other contributors process the information and it develops interpersonally rather than in this kind of secret, closeted, individually researched kind of way. You know, most of my videos are speculative. They really are. They're speculative. I have no idea sometimes when I start talking what I'm going to talk about, and a lot of the ideas I talk about I subsequently find out are either wrong or at very least partial, and I don't regard that as a problem. I regard that as my contribution to a set of ideas in process, and if people want to do something with that, either critique it or build on it or adapt it or do something with it, that's great too, and that's the game I'm in here. I feel myself to be part of a leaky network of contributors, and that knowledge is not being privately created by myself in my own little research environment and then drip fed out into the world only when I've got it polished and perfect, but rather I'm bleeding my ideas out into the world and seeing how they coagulate, if they do coagulate. So when people say that I'm going off half-cocked or that my work is under-researched or I haven't read enough books, I think that's absolutely fine. I don't regard that as a problem. And conversely, when I find people on here either feeling self-conscious because they haven't done the research, or criticising one another for not researching ideas fully before they open their mouth, I'm very ambivalent about that. I mean, it comes with some corollaries. You know, we have to take one another, or at least if you have the attitude that I have, you have to take everything you hear with a pinch of salt and not assume that because you're hearing it and it sounds authoritative, that it necessarily is authoritative. You know, you have to play the opposite number to the bleeding, leaky network emitter. You have to receive it in that spirit and do something with it. But I'm happy to do that. Is that it? Yeah, so it's just that really. I just like the idea of that. And it would be a shame if we all felt constrained in the same way that academia constrains you to only publish when you've fact-checked properly. This is not a newspaper, this is a conversation, in my opinion. This special effect's nice, isn't it? I've just been playing around with this camera. I'm such a dingbat sometimes when it comes to camera. But this one is called Monitor. Look, it can do things. I could probably find maybe I can find ways to do interesting things with it. So look. Oh, I don't know. So yeah, that's that really. I was going to say something else about it, but I can't remember what it was. Something to do with leaky networks and research. Yeah, I guess it's just to do with transparency. I mean, I like the idea of transparency. I mean, and you know, quite radical transparency. Transparency in political and international forums. Things like WikiLeaks is an example of that. Transparency in economics, and you know, there's a little bit more of that. More and more, certainly public salaries are being made available for public scrutiny. But also, I would like much more transparency in terms of knowledge communities. When I did my PhD, which is only a couple of years ago, I think I was one of the only people ever to do it in public. Probably the only person. I wrote my PhD online, and it was constantly available for public scrutiny. And I was constantly getting feedback from it. And that was a fascinating process. And I think I think research carried out in public, you know, with lots and lots of false starts and lots of bad ideas and lots of criticism at all points. You know, as long as you're resilient enough to take it, and kind of funding and support structures can allow that, I just think it's a really healthy way of doing it. So yeah, I suppose that's all I got to say really. It's just that I do hope that at least the corner of YouTube that I'm involved in doesn't get obsessive about its research and doesn't start getting all academic and professional about when it's okay to say things and when it's not. Thank you very much. Good night.